Those of you sitting towards the rear of the hall might want to come forward. It might make us feel a little bit less isolated and distant at this late stage in the conference. It's a vast auditorium that we've got here, and we didn't expect there to be many people. But what we have got, I think, is a panel, a couple of people who've joined us today who've got quite a lot of experience to share with you in the field of data ethics. So on my right, I've got Carly Kine from the Ada Lovelace Institute. Carly, as you know, is the director of Ada Lovelace. Is that correct? Director or CEO? Director. Yeah. And Ada Lovelace, you might have noticed in the news, has just published a very important report today on facial recognition. This is an issue that really strikes at the heart of what we might call data and an ethical approach to the use of data. So I'm going to ask Carly to say a few words about the work that the Ada Lovelace Institute has been doing in that field. On my left is Rochelle Trachtenberg from the American Statistical Association and Georgetown University, who joins us here to sort of share in the experience of the USA in this field of data ethics. After both Carly and Rochelle have had a chance to say a few words about their interests and what they're doing, I'll talk a little bit about the work of the Royal Statistical Society's Special Interest Group on data ethics. This is a newly formed special interest group, and we've had quite a few meetings to discuss what we're supposed to be doing, what we think we're doing, and how we're taking that forward. So I'll share our thinking with you. Then we'll just throw it open, take questions from you, and we'll try to respond to those questions. We've got an hour and a half. I don't think we will need an hour and a half, and so if we finish a little bit early, then so be it. So I'm going to start off by turning to Carly and asking her to say a little bit about the work of Ada Lovelace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks so much for coming. This is slightly daunting. I feel like there's a metaphor here for kind of ethics people speaking out into the void and not many people being here to listen. But I appreciate you all being here, and I will apologize in advance for the fact that I'm not a statistician, and I'm not very familiar with this community, I have to say, and in fact I'm very new to my job. I've been in place for a month and new somewhat to ethics. Certainly research ethics is not my background. I'm a human rights lawyer, actually, and so I come at ethics from legal approaches to ethics, and somewhat philosophical approaches to ethics rather than being embedded in practice as it applies in the research space. A little bit about Ada Lovelace Institute. As you may know, the RSS was instrumental in the founding of the Ada Lovelace Institute, and it was really in response to a call from the RSS that conversations began about establishing a body with a specific focus on data ethics. And this was probably 3 years ago now, almost 2017. And at that time, there was a general sense that new technologies were moving ahead, and emerging technologies and algorithms and AI were becoming more and more part of public sector and private sector initiatives, and that there wasn't really anybody whose remit it was to think about what does that mean for society, what does that mean for people's lives. In those intervening years, and it has taken somewhat of a long time to get Ada up and running, there have been some other new bodies emerge into this space, and of course we've seen existing bodies adapt, establish different streams, working groups, and subgroups. And importantly, in the UK, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation was established last year, which is the government's data ethics body. So Ada is still somewhat also finding its own place in this conversation and working out how we can make a unique contribution. At this stage, we're going to be focusing on research and policy recommendations around the use of data and AI. And we're interested in focusing on what values we think data analytics and data-driven technologies should comply with, respect, and reinforce. And in that respect, we're hoping to take a slightly different approach to some of these issues than other organisations which are really speaking to what the technology should look like. So how do we design technology that is accountable, fair, transparent, non-biased, non-discriminatory? Ada is instead going to look at what type of society do we want to build? How does the technology, which is one part of it, and the policy, research and regulation which buttresses it, lead us to a data-driven society that's consistent with certain social values? And we're interested in thinking about historical analogies with the Industrial Revolution, but also experiences in other countries as well as in Britain and in Europe, to how technology is changing social values. Which is why we decided to look at facial recognition as a first entree into the questions of data ethics. Facial recognition is emerging very much over the last few months as a kind of very public embodiment of how new technologies are changing people's lives. And I suppose it's somewhat the kind of sexy face of data-driven technologies at the moment. And I think it really, it invokes very strong reactions from all sectors of society, and it brings into the conversation a whole range of different issues that are not only about surveillance at the one end of the spectrum, but also identification, public spaces and how we consider public spaces, public national security and public benefit issues. And one of the things that we find facial recognition technology so interesting is because actually the underlying technology itself isn't very good at the moment. And in fact, there's real problems with the accuracy of facial recognition technology. And I'm sure that as statisticians, you will have much more developed thinking on that than I. But in terms of the kind of probabilistic nature of facial recognition matches, I think there are serious concerns around that. But nevertheless, the technology is being rolled out much, in a disproportionate manner to concerns around accuracy. And that tells us something about the kind of socio-technical nature of technology systems, which is their accuracy isn't necessarily the most important thing from the perspective of the public or from public sector bodies, but actually what can they help us solve or help us seem to be solving. I think that there's a real element when it comes to police use of facial recognition of the need to be seen to be doing something more to fight crime and make the public safer, and that new technology seems like a convenient salve for that problem. And I think you can't actually disconnect that from austerity and cuts in police funding over the last few years and the need to make up for cuts in police forces with new technologies that will help improve efficiency. So there's a lot of hyperbole out there around about facial recognition, and different actors have weighed in on that. And the Ada Lovelace Institute saw a gap in that conversation, which was around public attitudes and public opinion. It feels like nobody's actually asked people what they think of this yet. So there's a lot of debate in the public sphere between campaigners on the one hand, human rights activists, and the police and kind of security hawks on the other. But to what extent do the public actually understand what facial recognition is, how it's used, where it's being used, and do they have any opinions on it? And that was the question that we wanted to answer and we thought was a starting point for thinking about this new technology. We commissioned a YouGov poll of around 4,000 people, a national poll. And we asked a series of questions using use cases on facial recognition technology. So one of those use cases was about police use, but others reflected technology that's currently available on the market or is being advertised anyway by companies. We didn't get into the question around accuracy with the public. We kind of flagged that there are concerns around accuracy, but we nevertheless asked for their responses, their levels of comfort with respect to the rollout of the technology. So we used use cases as well, such as the use of facial recognition in supermarkets to determine a customer's age for the purposes of purchasing alcohol, which is a technology which is currently being rolled out in some supermarkets in the UK. We also proposed a use case around the use of facial recognition for hiring purposes. So Amazon and other companies have developed a tool whereby job candidates film themselves, and then the technology purports to be able to extract some personality characteristics from facial movements during a job interview. We used an example of facial recognition in public transport. So there have been some companies proposing that TfL in London or other local transport companies could replace ticket gates with facial recognition technology. And we also use the very important example of airports, of course, because that's where already we see facial recognition technology being used at border gates, but also many major airports are now proposing to extend it outside of border gates to movement throughout an airport generally. So we found that there was high awareness of facial recognition technology amongst the British public, but low knowledge. So lots of people had heard of it, and a good percentage of people claim to know something about it, but a very small percentage, less than 10%, claim to know a lot about it. Nevertheless, there were quite nuanced opinions on the part of the public. So even when people didn't know anything about facial recognition, they still expressed an opinion on it. So perhaps there's some statistical conclusion to make from that, but from a policy perspective, I think that's possibly the worst type of opinion, is the kind of less informed but strongly held opinions. But nevertheless, that's what this technology seems to invoke. We found quite high levels of public appetite for or comfort with police use of facial recognition technology, somewhere around 64%. But that appetite or comfort for police use was kind of dependent on the existence of safeguards. And the public differentiated between police use in what we called criminal investigations, and the example we gave of that was analysis of CCTV footage to locate a suspect, versus police use for day-to-day policing. And the example of that we gave was surveillance of a public space or a public event like a football match or a carnival. And we found that people were more comfortable with the technology being used in investigations versus in day-to-day policing. We nevertheless found that a majority of people, 55%, want the government to impose more restrictions on police use of facial recognition technology. So they wanted the government to limit the instances in which the police could use it. And we found a good chunk of people, almost 30%, very uncomfortable with the police use of facial recognition technology. We found actually the public overall wanted to be able to opt out of or consent to the use of facial recognition technology, even police use. So they were happy for the police to be using it, but they felt that they should be able to opt out of it. And that's a really interesting finding because, of course, the law, in the context of policing, consent and opting out is not a known concept really under data protection law. It's not an active thing in the current legal framework. So people instinctively felt they should be able to opt out of it, but that's not reflected in the law at all. There was very high levels of discomfort with use of facial recognition by the private sector. So less than 20% wanted to see it be used in supermarkets. Around 17% were happy for it to be used in supermarkets for age verification. 4% wanted to see it being used in recruitment processes, and around 7% for tracking shoppers in stores. We found, interestingly, that those who were uncomfortable with private sector use of facial recognition technology connected that discomfort to concerns about ethical uses of technology. And we gave them 10 different reasons for why they're uncomfortable with facial recognition technology in the private sector, and around 65% of people chose as their number one answer, I don't trust the companies to use it ethically. I think that's a really interesting finding because the concept of ethical use of technology is really quite a new one in the public domain anyway. And the fact that that reason resounded with respondents shows, I think, a great potential to really unpack what the public thinks is ethical use of technology on the part of companies. And finally, I'll just pull out two more things. One is that even though people were comfortable with, more comfortable with police use, they also said that they worry about the normalization of surveillance. And it shows that they're prepared to accept a trade-off between the normalization of surveillance for more public security, where there's a demonstrable link between facial recognition and public benefit. And finally, we found quite a high level of support for companies to put a pause on further sales of technology to police. Around 50% of people supported what we call a moratorium, but a pause on further sales. And 70% of people supported a pause on sales to schools, for example, who are considering using facial recognition technology for taking attendance records. So we released this report yesterday, and we think that we hope that it will be indicative of the approach that Ada will take going forward, which is to try to represent the public interest and the public voice in conversations about technology and data and ethical concerns. And we think the first step to representing the public is asking the public what they think. But that's really only the first step. The second step is very much to engage them in a more informed conversation. So out of this, what we're intending to do is set up what we're calling a Citizens Biometrics Council. And we're going to take 50 to 60 members of the public who we hope will represent a kind of representative and diverse sample of the public, and spend 6 months with them, not 6 months full time, but over the course of 6 months, hold a series of meetings with them where we'll teach them about biometrics technology and then ask for their more informed opinions and thoughts on how this technology should be used and governed. And that's a form of deliberative democracy, also known as a citizens' jury. You might have seen it's been used elsewhere around the country, notably with the referendum in Ireland last year. There was a citizens' assembly, so similar approach on a larger scale, but trying to engage members of the public in a more informed conversation about public policy is the intention there. So that's the first piece of work that we're going to be launching into. Beyond that, as I said, we're relatively new to this space, so we're still working out how we can make the most informed contribution and other areas that we'll be working on, and also how we can start to build a network across disciplines, and that's why I'm here today, to really understand how Ada can be supporting statisticians, where there are opportunities for us to engage and learn from your work as well. So I will stop myself there. I'm sorry, I spoke for quite a long time, actually.
No, thank you very much, Carlia. I think that's really interesting. I mean, this whole issue about the ethical use of electronically generated data is really at the heart of many of the concerns that we have and should have, particularly as statisticians who may well be using such data or making use of this kind of information. It worries me a little bit because, of course, any of us who've used the electronic gates at an airport will present your passport and stand there while the camera looks at your face and then the gate opens, or not. I really have wondered sometimes about the accuracy of this technology. Is it the fact that anybody who is trying to enter the country illegally is just not going to use those electronic gates, and therefore that's what we're relying upon if the technology itself is so dodgy? I don't know. The other thing that worries me, and this is a little anecdote, something I found out about very recently. A young man I know has been working in Ningbo in China. That's a big city near to Shanghai. And while he was there, he was mugged and asked to hand over some money. Of course, he stood out as a foreigner, and he handed over his money, and the assailant ran away with his money. He then reported that straight away to the police. About 15 or 20 minutes later, the police told him that they had arrested someone and they returned his money to him. Of course, he told them how much money was involved, and the police handed him back this money. And I said, how did they do it? He said, well, they used facial recognition technology. They had a video camera that had observed the theft. They used facial recognition technology. They knew where this person lived. They went round there and got the money back off them, and they arrested this person. And he said to me, don't you think that's fantastic? I said, well, did you get to see the person they arrested? No, he didn't. So I said, well, how do you know they got the right person? Well, they gave me the money back. Well, would they have wanted to do that because you're a foreigner in a city where you've just been mugged? It just gives you food for thought about the use of this technology. I'm now going to turn to Rochelle, and we've got a little bit of a change of scene here for Rochelle to talk now about the work that she's been doing, particularly the work with the American Statistical Association. So, Rochelle.
Thanks. Thanks for that, and I really appreciate the outline of the facial recognition study parameters and your questions, and the inclusion, the purposeful inclusion of the public's opinion in the discussion. This is a shift, I think, because I am a statistician, I'm a biostatistician, and a research methodologist, and I focus on measurement and outcomes. Carly and I were talking before we started about the importance of outcomes, and when you're using technology, everyone needs to agree on what the outcome will be so that the technology achieves that particular outcome and not ancillary or adjacent or totally unrelated ones. When it comes to biostatistics and other statistical issues, understanding the objective is key. The data ethics framework that the Department of Sport and Culture and Media or something that they have proposed, identifying your clear purpose for collecting data in a public project is their primary question. And it isn't explicit in that framework, but the rest of the principles all depend on your actual defined objective so that you can effectively weigh what risks you're creating with your project or program or analysis against the actual purpose and public good that that purpose brings. So it's a really important feature to the data science framework, data science ethics framework, to keep in mind that a specific purpose is important, but that everyone agrees on that, whatever the outcomes are, and that they can be measured appropriately. So part of my background is in measurement, and I'm a professor. So I teach statistics, and I also teach research ethics. And one of the challenges that we definitely have in the public is informing them about uncertainty. So when there's a clinical trial and the media say, oh, we can cure cancer in 1% of the very tiny, super homogeneous sample that was studied in, this very, very artificially constructed clinical trial that doesn't reflect regular practice at all, the media representation of that is cancer cure found. And so public perception of uncertainty is low, I'll just say. But when we train new users of statistics, just straight statistical methodology, graphs, t-tests, histograms, the representation of uncertainty tends to be lost in favor of the decision point, which is, of course, a p-value less than 0.05, or if you're really broad-minded in your educational program, a confidence interval of a particular size. So the issues around uncertainty permeate all of the considerations that we have in the use of technology and in the definition of outcomes. It's really important to focus on uncertainty and making sure that you've limited the uncertainty when you then deploy your model of whatever complexity or purpose it has and then interpret the results. So as the chair, the American Statistical Association has a committee on professional ethics, and I have chaired that. This is the end of my third year as the chair. I was the vice chair for 3 years, and I was the chair of the working group that revised the ethical guidelines for statistical practice in 2014 and then again in 2018. So the focus of the American Statistical Association has a long-standing sort of history. We do not adjudicate ethical challenges that come up. We are charged specifically with maintaining and updating the guidelines for ethical statistical practice and disseminating those guidelines. Again, I teach introductory statistics to people who are not statisticians, and my advocacy is to ensure that people who are learning about statistics or learning to use statistics learn to do so ethically. if you have a knowledgeable about ethical practices group tasked with interfacing with the public or the police or marketing or whoever the technology purveyors will be, they may be able to bring dimensions of ethical practice which include making sure the data were ethically sourced and ensuring that you have the technical capability to achieve the goals that have been articulated, so that if the goals have not been articulated, you cannot move forward. All of these things work together from an ethical practice framework, I feel. That's essentially sort of the limit of the ASA's, my role in the ASA's involvement. I'm sure there are data ethics pools around in the ASA, and since I'm not a data scientist and I deal mostly with experimental data that has been collected purposefully, so there's an objective and it's clear and we all agree on what the outcome is going to be. It's a very different way of thinking about statistics when you have an experiment, a design, a plan. You have to register it with the government if it's a clinical trial. Those things all have to be sorted beforehand and made public. And so that does not ensure ethical use of the data or ethical communication of the results of your study, because some people will misrepresent the magnitude or impact of their research to ensure that they continue to get funding. So there are complexities around just straight up statistical practice that arise from ethics around the data collection, its analysis, and its representation either within the statistics community or outside of the statistics community. And all of those, I think, are foundational in a sense to these discussions around ethical deployment of technology, and particularly the ethical use of electronically generated data. Because if we don't trust the practitioners who generate evidence from the data to have done so ethically, with a full consideration to the caveats that are appropriate for that data set, given that outcome, then we certainly cannot trust the decisions that are based on that data. And I guess the other thing that I would point out is 5-10 years ago, big data was a thing, apparently. So people talked about big data and its potential impact, but they didn't talk about whether or not the results that were obtained from bigger and bigger and bigger data sets were better than those that were collected from purposeful experimental projects. And so now you have data science as a thing, and people just want to use the technology, it's magic, and people talk about it all the time. Public or lay conversations around the technology are quite hyperbolic, as you suggested. And it's really difficult to combat that. Even in my own family, I have a niece, and she is studying data science. So I've been a statistician for 25 years, and they said, she's just like you. And I was like, I'm sure she's brilliant. She's your daughter. She's a special flower, but let's give her a little time, like, I don't know, a couple weeks. And so there's real, these challenges really exist. So communicating what the difference is between a data scientist and an experimental methodologist is never going to happen. But we need to appreciate that people's mindsets really don't necessarily process the details the same way the people who do it every day, or the people who are that adjacent every day, or the people who are just hearing about it in the news, that all of these perceptions are, and this isn't a statistical issue, this is a cognitive issue, that people have these biases and their conceptions drive the way they perceive information, and that's why you have people whose biases drive their decision-making rather than their ability to work with evidence and make a decision based on information that you give them and not just based on their preconceived ideas or what they heard or what emotionally resonates with them.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. I think what we've heard from Carly and from Rochelle really underpins the reasoning behind us within the Royal Statistical Society setting up a special interest group. This was really work. The idea, the initiative has come from Tom King, so very much at his initiative and with a lot of effort on his part, this special interest group has come together. And the one thing that we've been trying to do within that group is to think about how we can focus the work that we need to do over the next year or so. And at various meetings, we've been discussing the priorities with which we should attach to various fields of effort. What we've agreed so far, and there's a big agenda here, and so I think we're just beginning to sort of scratch the surface. What we've agreed so far is that we've noted a lot of public engagement work of different types is going on across the country. And it might be public engagement on specific issues. For example, what Carly has talked about was specific to this issue of facial recognition. But a lot of it is just about the public perceptions of how their data might be used when they haven't necessarily given permission for their data to be used. So this is about consent, it's about privacy, but it's much, much deeper than that. It's about the way in which the analytical professions, particularly the statistical profession, should engage with new forms of data, new types of data, when you're undertaking analysis. And I think it's that interest within the statistical profession that we are trying to address. And how do we deal with this? We decided, therefore, that one of the first things that we need to do is to try to encourage some coordination between all the different types of public engagement work that's going on in this area. Another field that we want to address is about the international landscape. We've heard from Rochelle about what's happening in the USA. And one of the comments that Rochelle made yesterday was about the efficacy of the institutional review boards, which are equivalent to the research ethics committees we have within our universities and higher education institutes in the UK. Ethics committees which effectively approve or disapprove of research projects, research proposals. And these IRBs in the USA, you were saying yesterday that they are not really fit for purpose. I don't think I'm scientifically fit for purpose. So one of the things we like to do is to reach out to other countries to find out what problems they are confronting, what problems they may be trying to address, and how we might share in their experience and also share our experience here, because we've got quite a lot going on in the field of data ethics in the UK. We're not wonderfully coordinated at the moment. This is something that I think this special interest group will be looking at. So on our agenda is to reach out to a number of countries to identify those people and organizations who are working in this field and to seek to collaborate, to join with them and to share knowledge, expertise where appropriate. And finally, an area that we've identified as one that the Special Interest Group would take a very significant interest in is the whole issue about ethics education. And we have relied too much on a very limited body of knowledge at the moment. Quite often within our research ethics committees at the institutional level in the UK, we don't have statistical expertise. And I think that's a very appalling situation that we face if that is the case. And even when we do have that statistical expertise, does that statistical expertise have the kind of ethical knowledge, experience that they can draw upon, which will enable them to say, hang on, what do we know about the provenance of these data? What is it you're trying to do with these data? What kind of results do you think you will generate? Who might be affected by those results and who might not be affected? What about fairness? What about justice and equity? These are the sorts of issues that we now need to bring to the fore. How we tackle this, I'm not sure, and this is what the Special Interest Group will be thinking about over the next year or so. So I'm now going to open it to questions from the floor, questions you might have, so please. There is a roving microphone, I think.
My name's University of Glasgow, we have a big data analytics program and so on. And I haven't managed to get to all of the data ethics sessions, so some of my comments and or questions may have been dealt with, but hopefully you'll forgive me if it sounds, that I've just not listened. The first thing is, so I'm a practicing statistician. I'm not an ethicist, and this is an important area which we have recognized we have to do better at training our, we graduate probably more than 200 people each year with a statistics or a statistics and something degree. And we're trying to embed data ethics into that, but we're not necessarily specialists ourselves. So I think education and educational resources absolutely is really important. Now, students are clearly a rather specialised part of the community, but it's not just about research ethics in some senses. Most of them won't go on to become research statisticians. They're going to be sitting in Tesco Bank, for instance, or the Royal Bank of Scotland, and so on. So it's not just about research, it's the more general question. So any tips you have about resources that could be embedded into some of these programs would be really, really useful. The other question I have is, and I don't know if I mean, it may sound really stupid, what's the difference between data governance, which I hear a lot of people also talking and writing about, and data ethics? Are they subsets of each other? Do they overlap? What's the clarity? And then in terms of the international aspects, how do we deal with a situation where some of the electronic collectors of our data are transnational organisations that appear to be able to escape paying income tax, for instance, in countries that they appear to be registered in or operating in or not? So what are the chances that actually this whole data governance, data ethics can have that international aspect? Because, how can we make the Googles of the world actually adhere to either principles or practices or regulation or law in one part of the world which may be very different in another part? Sorry, that may sound a bit rambly, but it's just, I thought I'll get it off my chest.
So, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay, so I think it wasn't a ramble, it was like a circle that you walked in. I think that making sure that everyone we give a degree in statistics to also understands what it means to practice statistics ethically, that's a non-negotiable in my mind. Of course, no one in the United States believes me, so let's do it in UK. But I think that internationally, the fact that reporting has to be transparent. You should be certain of the ethical sourcing of the data you analyze. You need to work within your parameter, your skill set. You need to be upfront about the limitations of the data and do your best to ensure that the people who take your results don't then misrepresent them. Those are all features, non-negotiable, I would argue, features of any ethical statistical report. The training that we give to statisticians doesn't address that. At the undergraduate level in the United States, it doesn't for sure. And in the master's level and doctoral level, the fact that people are going to go, they're not going to be researchers, they're going to be academics, or they're going to be building theories of new estimation parameters or whatever. You still have to report those things ethically and completely and transparently. So I think that if, in terms of international training or international application of ethical guidelines for practice, will address some of the concerns in terms of educational resources. So one of them would be the ethical practice guidelines. I would, of course, tout the ASA ones because there are 54 different elements, so they describe a lot more of practice to the new practitioner, making much more elaborate the fact that first your data comes in, and then you look at it and say, wait, I can't handle this problem. That's part of the ASA guidelines. If you can handle the problem, but you can't communicate it well, or you communicate it and they cherry pick, that's also in the guidelines. So they're quite elaborate, and I think that in terms of, it's not ASA versus RSS, it's just that it's quite elaborate. If that sort of training can happen, then all of the practitioners irrespective of where they sit, will at least have that foundational level of appreciation for not data ethics or not data governance, but their responsibilities as practitioners, even if they don't do it every day or it's not their job title. And the ASA guidelines specify that anyone who uses statistics is obliged to do that ethically, even if it's 1 hour a week or 1 hour a month. Spend that 1 hour doing ethics, doing statistics in an ethical way. So that, in terms of the international challenges that you have, but in terms of data ethics and data governance, the primary distinction that I hear is sort of, what can the government impose, a rule that would be general, versus collecting data, storing data, analyzing data, and making money off of data would be sort of a data ethics. That's the distinction that I sort of infer, but people they don't really talk explicitly about that distinction.
Yeah, I suppose, thanks for your questions, Marie. I think very, no small, big questions there. My perspective on the data governance versus data ethics thing is really, for me, data governance is about what is legal or what should be legal, and data ethics is almost the political of it in a way, like small p political, in the sense that, you know, data governance, I think, can speak to how we collect it, how we store it, how we, the security controls on it, retention, deletion, etc. Whereas data ethics, I think, asks the should question: should we collect it at all? Or if we're collecting that data, what data are we not collecting? I think the provenance question is really interesting from a statistician angle, but also what data aren't we using or aren't we finding? And in a world in which everything is supposed to be data-driven these days, including policy, what data aren't we collecting or analysing? So for me, those data ethics questions are the broader kind of political questions. And then linking into your question around taxation, it's not a governance question so much, a data governance question, but a societal and political question about how do we want to ensure that the financial benefits of data-driven systems and technologies are equitably distributed, including through taxation as a mechanism. For me, that's a political question as much as anything. So I think data ethics is a useful catch-all, but at the end of the day, it's a subjective and political discourse, and I think data governance is much easier objective framework in which we can talk about how should we legally and policy-wise restrict and govern the use of data, but data ethics brings in all of those other questions as well. And I don't think I have an answer to your question about how to make international companies pay, other than to say that, back to Peter's point, I think we need a kind of global conversation about the ethics of data and linking that up with global regimes for regulation and taxation as well.
Thanks. I think I'd just add to that one of the key elements that the Special Interest Group is going to focus upon is transnational working of those in the statistical profession. As we know, sometimes projects get located in one country as opposed to another because they're easier to do in that country. And that raises big questions about why has that situation arisen? What ethical guidelines is it that you're trying to get round by locating your research in this kind of so-called international sphere, when in fact what you're really trying to do is do something that you want to do without with the minimum of fuss? That raises all sorts of ethical issues. There's a question at the middle. Here it comes.
It's two questions, and
Could you state your name and...
Jake Ansell, Edinburgh University Business School. The first one is, it is quite good for statisticians to be regularised, but a lot of people who do statistics, particularly in things like banks and other businesses, are not statisticians, and we should bear that in mind. And they are people who are likely to come up with ideas which would not fulfill our desires. The second one is the debate about open data and the ethical implications. And again, you have actually quite clearly stated, very helpfully, that purpose has got to be to the fore. But unfortunately, open data is not of necessary of that ilk. And whilst it has got governance constraints on it, and we're happy to have the governance constraints on it, there is a question about how we manage to look at outcomes and the implications. And it's not necessarily misrepresentations I would be particularly worried about, but there's a whole set of other issues around that, which I think we need to be conscious of.
Thank you. Carl, do you want to start on these?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well, so I think it's really interesting because I just had a question. So open data means you collect data. Sometimes it's funded by the government. Sometimes you just collect it because you record the Twitter stream or whatever. So you obtain this data, and for example, the Public Library of Science, the PLOS journals require that you share your data. So if you want to publish a paper with data that's been analyzed in it, that data has to be made available to any interested person. So it must be open. And there are places where you can store this data that you've collected. And in the US, federal funders require that you share your data, or you have a plan for sharing your data. And that plan can say, well, I don't plan on sharing this data. But you can't just say that. Now you have to have a reason why, and then you have to say you're going to destroy it or whatever. So you have tensions. The data are ethically collected. You have a very specific purpose for the collection of the data. And there is a discussion. It's not, it hasn't arisen to the level of sort of, should the ASA have a policy about it, or should there be a rule? But there is a conflict between having your data be open and available and then making sure it actually is, versus collecting your data, answering your question, and then destroying the data. We had a question in the session yesterday about a rare disease. So if you've collected your data, it was funded, and you collected all 120 cases in Canada, and I have the 17 cases in Ireland, we would do better if we could put our data together. But if the funders or whatever restrictions prevent them from being joined, or we didn't promise to make it shareable or open, then that limits that kind of research. So again, I mean, I think it isn't a question that people are talking about in a research context, because it's sort of, we're getting mixed messages. So if you want to publish your work in an open journal, they may require that you share your data. But the American Psychological Society's journals, or the American Psychological Association journals, require that you sign a contract on your copyright transfer that says, if anyone who's qualified asks me for my data, I promise I will share it. And there was a UK group, I think, either the UK or the Netherlands, evaluated all of the papers that were published in 2011. And of that group, only 7% or something actually shared the data. And the tendency to agree to share the data was associated with better quality statistics. And the people who disagreed to share the data, the analysts found, I think it was a Netherlands group, they had potential problems in their data analysis. And so the conclusion was, maybe people won't share their data if they think you're going to find that they didn't do it right, or their analyses were dodgy. So there are these challenges. That is not a data sharing or open science issue. It's a ethical practice of statistics and transparent communication of your results issue at heart, but it is manifested in this willingness to share data. But there are conflicting sort of policies, and a person who doesn't want to share their data can just not publish in an open venue, make sure it's federally funded, and you told them you were going to destroy it, and then you do destroy it. So there's definitely no sort of coherent plan that I've seen in the US for unifying the theme around open or sharing of data in that experimental context.
Did you want to come back?
I just wanted to point out, what I was talking about is administrative data from the government, which is a major issue.
Yeah.
Some years ago in the Royal Society, we created a report called Science as an Open Enterprise. And we argued in that report that there should be much more emphasis placed upon particularly administrative data being put into a public domain and made available for research. And the rationale behind this was to improve and increase the reproducibility of research. So it's not just about researchers putting their small data set up on the web somewhere so that others could look at it, but getting hold of data sets that could then be used or reused, repurposed. Now, having done this, and I was one of the authors of that report, I was then quite shocked when I was asked to review a project. And the project was making use of open data sources. One of those open data sources is what's called the Open Electoral Register. And this has got the names and addresses of people who are registered to vote in the UK. There was also another open data set, which was about the quality of housing stock at a very detailed level, house by house. And this proposal was to examine the relationship between ethnicity and maintenance of the housing stock. And the way ethnicity was going to be created was by software to process the names, particularly the last names of individuals. And this software is actually quite good at predicting ethnicity from names. And this would then be linked to whether or not particular ethnic groups had got the ability, the wherewithal, the finances to maintain the housing stock. Fortunately, that project was rejected because you could imagine how those research results would have fared had they got into the wrong hands. It was just inappropriate and not well thought out. So we were saved by ethical review in that instance. So that was an area where open data had really created something that we hadn't really thought about particularly. And it's only by having a strong approach and an informed approach to data ethics that we can prevent these sorts of things happening. I very much approve of open data and open science, transparency, but it needs to be regulated very carefully.
Can I just jump in there just to quickly say there is some work being done to think about innovative ways that you can share data, make data open that still protects ethical concerns and privacy. So one of those is the concept of data trusts, which you might be familiar with. The Open Data Institute have recently done some trials with a number of local authorities in the UK looking at whether or not you can take open data sets and put them in kind of governed or they call them trusts, but they're not legal trusts. But it's a slight adoption of the word, and there's some problems around that, I think. But whether or not we can imagine there being kind of independent entities whose responsibility it is to decide who has access to that trust and how the data is used, and you could apply for use of the data from a data trust, and that would be a charitable entity, for example, who would have its own governing terms of reference. And those types of things that equally there's kind of data commons, so technological means of creating data commons whereby people could contribute data and then apply to use that data for particular means. I think exploring those is a really interesting way to evolve that conversation. So it's not only about ethical decision making, but also putting in place practical ways to do that.
If I could just follow up, I think it's, I'm really glad you brought those, the idea of the trust and the comments up, because one of the ways a default mechanism for controlling access to data has been, unfortunately, do you have a PhD? Are you at a university? So the policies around journal and other sharing, request considerations are you qualified? As we were talking yesterday, people who are on the IRB are experienced at reviewing, but not necessarily understanding the scientific design or the statistical, features of a proposal. So having people who are experienced, but not necessarily scientifically ready to evaluate innovative applications of technology or statistical methodology, making a determination that's driven by their preconceived idea of being at a better university or whatever. So you have these things that are already in place where you would apply because you're a known contributor. So your proposal would get a higher likelihood of approval. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism is if I want to get data from the Parkinson's Association in the United States, I would ask for funding from them to analyze their data. So they're vetting me, they're evaluating my qualification to receive their money and their data. And so this is really closed system, but you do have to demonstrate that you're qualified in some way at that level. The challenge is when, if I have graduate students, they don't have any money, and I don't have money for them, so I want them to apply for open data or just go out and get data. Because of the situation in the United States right now, they are not trained in ethical practice, so their understanding of the dependency of their results on the ethical sourcing of the data is missing. So again, I think that wider spread training in ethical practice would benefit the open data sort of projects that go on, because graduate students and undergraduates, if they go out and find free, open data that they don't have to collect, they can just do whatever they want to it, and it won't be evaluated by an IRB because it's not institutional, it's a training exercise or something, and according to US federal guidelines, that would have a different degree of consideration by the Institutional Review Board. So again, the idea that understanding your responsibilities and obligations with respect to ethical practice will help in some way level the playing field when open data are utilized, but also understanding and appreciating that there is already something that's pretty biased, but at least it exists. It's some way of considering the qualification of a person to get the data or use the data, look at the question they've asked or whatever. Those do exist, and maybe those can be leveraged, improved, broadened, or tied in to the educational questions, that if you have a capstone or some end of term project, it could be look at an open data source, look at the ethical guidelines for utilizing data, do an essay or whatever, a matchup to make sure that you've met the criteria, and then do your project. So you could add an ethical dimension that the student does to their use of open or widely available data.
Oh yes, two people over here.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Donald Simeon, University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm really pleased to be here and to note that you have a special interest group in data ethics. I myself, I'm a biostatistician. I'm also involved in ethics for the last 10 years or more. I actually chair a couple research ethics committees in my country, and so I'm in a very unique position to really, have my background and be involved in ethics. The issue of data science is new to the Caribbean, to Trinidad and Tobago, but there are a couple persons who are practicing, and of course we have no guidelines, so they have more or less a free rein to do whatever they wish. What is good is that we are developing a national policy for research ethics, and I'm pushing to have, some section, some aspect of it addressing data ethics. And I'm hoping that the RSS can perhaps provide us with some guidelines as to what can perhaps be placed in that policy. And also the issue of capacity development. The reality is that most of the research ethics committee members don't have any training at all to appreciate the issues related to big data, the data ethics in general. And that type of capacity development is what we really need. So I am looking forward to perhaps knowing more about the special interest group, and of course what sort of support you can provide. Pleased as well to hear that you plan to have an international flavor to the interest group, and I myself am pleased to be here for this conference and to know about it. So of course I look forward to hearing more about what can be done.
Well, let me just respond first of all by saying you must give me your details. We need to talk, definitely. This is exactly what I was referring to when I said we need to reach out, and I think there's a reach in both directions here. But let me turn to my colleagues on the panel.
Well, so one thing that I think is really interesting that was mentioned earlier is a proliferation of policies or frameworks or conceptualizations of data ethics. And I just finished a book where I looked at the data ethics framework, which is a checklist with a workbook that the government, the UK government created, and it's free. You can get it online at gov.uk. And so data ethics framework. And then there's also something called the Data Science Ethics Checklist, and that's available at deon.org. These two checklists exist. They are synthesized from the same source materials. Yesterday we saw the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries ethics framework, which almost verbatim captures probably 3 of the 4 principles in the Association of Computing Machinery ethics. It's called the Code of Ethics. So I think that on the one hand, people object to the fact that the American Statistical Association says, here's how everything should be done, and why should we do everything the way the Americans do it? I totally get that, and you want to have your own sort of culture / industrial specific guidelines or whatever, and we run the risk of either you use framework 1, you use 2, I use 3, and we never recognize the fact that they have the almost 100% overlap. What's missing from the actuaries, the difference between the actuaries' ethical framework and the Association of Computing Machinery is the same thing that is different between the American Statistical Association guidelines and the ACM Code of Ethics, and that is a focus on when a computing system becomes infrastructure, what do you do? The American Statistical Association does not consider that because that's not necessarily what statisticians think about, but it is what computing professionals think about. So I think that one of the important things about international considerations are not to rush to come up with something new, but to survey the landscape, literally and figuratively, to ensure that what you're doing is in fact better than or addresses a gap that you can see when you compare two methods. So I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I had suggested to possibly to the Committee on Professional Ethics that we just sort of track. There was a time when I think Iran and I want to say Tibet had considered adopting the American Statistical Association ethics code for their national ethics framework, their national statistical ethics framework. So there, I was thinking, okay, well, we should just see, who adopts RSS? Is it only, colonies and former colonies, or is it, everybody in the world tends to use the RSS code? That would suggest to me, the person in charge of making sure that the ASA code is accessible and usable, it's too expansive, or it's not interpretable, or it's too limited to the US context or whatever. So that's information that I can use. I won't be able to use anymore because I'm getting off the committee, but that's something that people who maintain these codes can utilize to understand the sort of functional, not necessarily public, but sort of the worldwide acceptability of their frameworks. We can't do that when people are seeking to create their own frameworks that completely overlap with what has been done for 40 years or 70 years or things like that. So that's, I guess I would suggest that as you embark on a policy, you definitely survey the landscape and start with the ACM guidelines, because they've been in pretty much the same shape they're in now for 30 years. They're really strong, and they came out strong. So I would check there and look at the guidelines and their overlap, and make sure that you don't choose the most complex or the least complex, because that isn't necessarily you want to have a purpose and then choose if there's one that fits your purpose best, you can maybe adapt 2 or 3, that's great, but if not, then you can see you've done a needs analysis and you see that there's a gap, and you can fill it, and that will direct your policy making as well in a much more focused way, because you'll say, well, ASA says this, RSS says this, ACM says this, here's a big gap, and we don't have anything there, let's fill that gap.
Cathal.
I don't have much more to add other than to say that, slightly back to Marie's initial question, I think that a really important message to get across is that data ethics is not a checklist, it's a process, and instilling that in everybody that you're talking to and working with and getting on board with this is really important. I don't think having guidelines is excellent, having checklists is excellent, but this is going to be an iterative process, and it has to respond to changes in society as well. So transmitting that is part of the challenge as well.
It's dynamic.
Yeah.
And let's take the last question from this gentleman here.
Okay, thank you. Phil Crook, International Development Section. I was going to say that introducing the camera surveillance, the facial technology, reminds me of when they brought in speed cameras. And it was regarded as cheating. It was okay to be stopped by an actual policeman for speeding, but somehow being stopped by a camera was playing dirty. But having come back just from Western China, where the Uyghurs are being surveilled, well, quite densely by cameras. I mean, there were 7 cameras in the front of our bus. There was probably a set of cameras every 50 yards on the street. When the woman in front of us jaywalked, our guide said, if she's recognized by facial surveillance, she'll lose social credit. And if she loses too much social credit, she won't be able to get a passport or travel on a high-speed train or change house or get a job. It struck me at the time, I just wondered how many machines or people were surveying what the surveillance cameras were picking up. You know, there were 7 cameras in the front of our bus. But that's set aside. That's just an anecdote. Rochelle said something which, updating ethical guidelines. Now, I just hope that doesn't mean that something that wasn't ethical a few years ago is now ethical.
Oh, it
Because
absolutely.
I've sort of got it in my mind that somewhere at the base of all this is something like Asimov's first law of robotics, which says that data may not be used to harm any human being. Now, but I should perhaps read the ACM guidelines to discover if that's the case.
Well, so I'm glad you brought that up, because I shared yesterday when we were talking about the lessons learned in the ASA revisions. And one of the principles that changed was in 1999, data dredging, which is depending on how old you are, very familiar term, and very bad, was absolutely, this is not ethical, don't do this. It was probably principle number 2 on the list of 54. And of course, in 2014, when we went to revise the guidelines, we recognized that there's what eventually became called data science, and there's p-hacking. So there's when I first saw it, I thought, well, data science is just data dredging. How did that become ethical all of a sudden? But in fact, it's a refinement of the construct that if you have a purposeful data dredging expedition with a predefined goal, then that constitutes, I asked a question, I found the data source, I looked in the data source using, pre-planned methods or whatever, and came out with the result, versus I collected the data, I asked a question, it wasn't significant, so I kept looking until I found the only significant thing in the pile, which is the definition of p-hacking. So it didn't change from Asimov's Rule 1 to 1A or 1 prime, although it looks like it did. But I think that that gets back to my earlier comment about that transparency and completeness and integrity in your representation of yourself, and making sure that the way other people use your work is consistent with the guidelines. Those are, I would argue, internationally valid, and also have not changed. But what has changed is sort of specifying that p-hacking constitutes disruptive and, in some cases, scientific misconduct. Statistical misconduct, surely, but scientific misconduct, depending on who the reviewing body is. But yeah, it's but the fields are dynamic, so we need to, keep in mind that something that wasn't even possible before, like multiple Bayesian models running simultaneously, and then you choose the winner. That's actually a method now. Whereas 20 years ago, that would have been called data dredging. So it's the what you can do will definitely need to be taken into account when you think about, is that plausible? But if you do it in a scientific framework, then it fits a scientific definition. So anytime you're data dredging or p-hacking, it isn't appropriate, no matter how much technology changes or.
Sorry, just one more. Let's make these very quick questions and responses, please. We're just about running out of time.
Thank you. Rosemary Bailey, University of St Andrews. I'm not quite sure if it fits in, but there were some comments earlier on about when people are doing studies, there should be some people looking over it and saying if it makes sense. And something I come across quite often is pseudo-replication in experiments. Now, when I was first working at Rothamsted, this didn't used to happen so much because statisticians were always involved in approving experiments. Now we all have computers. Who needs statisticians? And people are publishing studies where they sprayed chemicals on one large part of Germany, didn't in one other large part, and took replication within. Does data ethics, should it include having some sort of oversight of things like that where you're going to do bad science?
Ooh, okay, a big question. I'm going to try to answer that first. How does improving our ethical approach to statistical analysis and science generally, does it prevent bad science? I think not. We'll always have bad science with us. We will always need peer review as a way of helping us to prevent bad science. But sometimes bad science is going to happen anyway, and we've simply got to recognize bad science when we see it. I guess I have a kind of evolutionary approach to this, that good science will win out. You might not agree with that, but I don't think that just taking ethical oversight, improving ethical education, understanding more and putting procedures in for ethical review is going to prevent bad science, quite honestly, but others might disagree.
No, I would agree that I think that we don't necessarily train scientists to be stewards of their discipline or stewards of science. We do train them to value publication over making a real contribution. So I have argued in my research ethics and my statistics courses that it isn't about making a contribution to your CV. It is about making a contribution to the world or the knowledge base or people's methodology. So I think an interesting thing about the RSS focus and the data ethics framework focus is the public good has to be prioritized. And the ACM, number one criterion in decision making in the ACM is you must prioritize the public good over every other consideration. In my field, because I'm a scientist, I want to prioritize the public good, but also the scientific community. So if I make a contribution only to my CV, or if I help my students make contributions only to their CV, I'm not furthering the discipline, and I'm also damaging the scientific community by perpetuating that model.
Carly, do you have any words?
I don't have any points.
But one, really is the last point, but please make it very quickly.
Hi, my name's Ian Hunt. I work in Australia, which is an ethical Wild West. But I wanted to ask, it's a yes-no answer, I guess. Is there a place for the statistical societies and associations around the world to provide the means or a conduit to challenge models that you're being affected by, either as a private citizen or an institution in a particular country? Can we set something up so if I'm searching for someone to help in a particular court case, so for instance, a long time ago I worked on with a probation officer who was challenging the computer system which was effectively replacing his decision process. And there was nothing. There was me as a private statistician. It would be great if the interest groups within the statistical organisations facilitated challenge.
All I can say to that is that we will promote the work of the Special Interest Group. We're accessible. You'll have our names, our email addresses, and we are there. Whether or not this is going to lead to any kind of worldwide register of those with a kind of interest in the area, I doubt very much, but who knows? One step at a time, I think, and we're taking, I think, one small step in the right direction here.
But the American Statistical Association just initiated an expert witness training program for statisticians. And I'm a cognitive scientist and I work in education, so I was on the board that tried to parameterize that training, that curriculum. One of the things that we thought about as an objective would be to create a list of people who were qualified to serve as expert witnesses, and that was shot down. So that didn't happen. So you can go to the expert witness training and not be qualified. Like, we wouldn't put your name on a list because you completed it. But that sort of thing has been discussed. So if you want to email me, I may be able to put you in touch with, because there are people who are statisticians and lawyers, and we definitely have, in terms of education, we have outreach for journalism and outreach for law, and those two domains are definitely active, not necessarily internationally or explicitly internationally, but definitely something that the ASA is concerned with, is making sure that statistics are utilized appropriately in a legal context.
So there's an offer. Come and see Rochelle after this. Okay, I'd like now to thank both of my panelists, Carly and Rochelle, for very interesting insights that have been offered into their work and also their views on this very important area. I hope also you've taken away from this session today something about the importance that the Royal Statistical Society now attaches to this whole field of data ethics. And it crosses many of the sections of the Royal Society. How it will evolve, I don't know. I think that's really up to the members of the Special Interest Group to show that we've got something to offer. So I'm looking forward to Bournemouth a year from now, when hopefully we will be able to talk about what we have achieved what we will achieve over the next year. Thank you all very much for your interest. Thank you for attending today. And those of you who have a strong interest, I look forward to seeing you in Bournemouth next year. Thank you.